All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before I turn things over to our speakers, please know that we will be setting aside some time at the end of today's discussion for audience questions. If you have a question for any of our speakers today, please use the Q&A button to type your question into the box at any time throughout our webinar. Please include your name and organization with your question so that we can identify you for our speakers. Now, to start us off, I'd like to kick things over to Stoneleigh Foundation's Deputy Director, Marie Williams. Marie,
Thank
take it
you,
away.
Mark. Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to Trauma is Not Destiny, Resilience Through Trauma, a conversation about how NGOs, philanthropic partners, and government can help ensure that the voices of those with lived experience are meaningfully incorporated into strategies, approaches, and policies to address some of our society's most difficult issues. Before we get started, as Mark said, I'm Marie Williams, Deputy Director at the Stoneleigh Foundation. For those of you not familiar with Stoneleigh, we're a Philadelphia-based foundation that seeks to advance change in systems that impact the lives of young people. We do that through fellowships that support the development of transformative leaders and by helping those fellows build and expand their influence and amplify their voices in their respective fields. Stoneleigh is pleased to host this conversation today because it showcases what was for us, frankly, somewhat of a deviation from our standard funding model, but one that we strongly believe was warranted. For other funders present today, you'll recall that around 2020, when the nation was in a state of social turmoil, we were challenged to assess whether we had given adequate space to sometimes marginalized voices, and many of us found ways to answer the call to do so. At Stoneleigh, among the many ways we sought to do that was to emphasize to our fellowship candidates that we wanted to see projects that meaningfully partnered with communities and with individuals with lived experience of the problems and the issues that the fellowship project sought to address. Around that time, I personally was already in conversation with Human Rights for Kids and its CEO, James Dold, considering how we might partner with them on their very important work to advocate for those who were incarcerated as children for causing harm that stemmed directly from their experiences as survivors of sexual abuse. Through those conversations, I was reminded of the really important work of Sara Kruzan, who from the time of her release from prison has been a staunch and effective advocate for survivors. Certainly, Sara qualified as someone whose work would make her a very promising and attractive candidate for a Stoneleigh Fellowship. But together, James and I talked about the other Saras out there, people who, as a result of their experiences, wanted to contribute to advocacy work, but had in the past been relegated to the role of poster children, or tokenized, or parachuted in to stand merely as an object lesson representing a broken system without being provided adequate supports to be effective advocates, and at the same time, attend to the trauma of often being asked to recall and recount the worst things that had ever happened to them. As a result of those conversations, Stoneleigh decided to fund not only Sara, but Human Rights for Kids as an organization, a departure from Stoneleigh's standard funding practice, as they grappled with how to create a model that enables people with lived experience to show up as advocates without incurring the considerable costs of re-traumatizing themselves. So that's the backdrop of the funding partnership between Human Rights for Kids and Stoneleigh, and the core reason that we thought it was important to host this conversation, to perhaps encourage others to think creatively about what it really means to make space for those with lived experience, not just as symbols of the problem, but as a part of the solution. So with that, I'll hand it over to James Dold, CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids.
Thank you so much, Marie. And let me just start by thanking you and the entire team at the Stoneleigh Foundation for your incredible support over these many years now and for hosting this very important conversation. We wouldn't be here today if it weren't for your visionary leadership and we are deeply appreciative of all you've done for us. My name is James Dold, and I'm the CEO and founder of Human Rights for Kids. We're a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., that is working to advance criminal justice reform for children throughout the United States in compliance and in consistency with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Um, you know, we when we first were getting started, we had a very tumultuous time getting our organization off the ground. And I want to begin with that a little bit because the support that Stoneleigh provided really gave us the runway we needed to really build out our programs and to bring on people who had lived experiences within the system. And I want to start by telling that story by going back to my own childhood. When I was around 5 or 6 years old, I was sexually abused by another child in my family. This left me with an intense feeling of shame and guilt and something that I carried with me for many, many years and that I struggled to adequately articulate to my family. When I eventually did, I did not get the response that I was hoping to, and that left me vulnerable to other adults in the community that had sinister intentions. When I was 13 years old, I met a parent who was who was a volunteer in my Boy Scout troop who ended up sexually abusing me, grooming me, and really causing me to develop a traumatic bond where I ended up running away from home and going to live with this other family where I toiled in domestic servitude for over 2.5 years. So from eighth grade through my sophomore year in high school, I was going to this other family's house, living with them, cooking, cleaning, taking care of kids, all the while being emotionally, physically, and sexually abused. And when I eventually returned home, I was grateful for the supports that I had through coaches, teachers, and mentors, but there are still behavioral issues that came up for me. I engaged in all sorts of delinquent conduct, such as shoplifting, school fights, underage drinking, smoking marijuana, all of these behavioral issues that I really couldn't explain why I was engaging in them, just that I was kind of angry at the world, right? And I was very fortunate that I did not become system involved myself, a fate that befell just about every other member of my family who grew up in the situation that we did in the inner city of Las Vegas. And so that really, formed the backdrop of my life experiences and why I went to law school. I wanted to change the system. I wanted to make the world a better place. And as I came out of law school, I focused initially on combating human trafficking, something I had experienced as a child. And then Sara's case really inspired me to want to go and work to end life without parole sentences, because I just found it incredibly disheartening that there were children who had committed crimes against their abusers or their sex traffickers, and they were being sentenced to life without parole. It just didn't seem fair to me. And so that really inspired the first part of my work coming out of law school. And that led me to eventually start Human Rights for Kids alongside a bipartisan group of state lawmakers. We have Republicans and Democrats on our board of directors from all over the country, places as diverse as Arkansas and West Virginia. But in the beginning, it was really hard for us because we didn't have funding. We started in 2017, and Sara and I were volunteers at that time at the organization because we couldn't find funding to do this work, despite the fact that in my prior work, I had a long track record of success and a board of directors who were comprised of policymakers who also believed in the vision and our theory of change that had brought about significant change across the country. And eventually, we were able to get some initial funding in 2019, which allowed me to start work at Human Rights for Kids for full time. But that also left me with a bit of a guilty conscience because early on in 2017, Sara and I had developed a concept of what we used to call Sara's Law. And, we got bills introduced all over the country. We were going and testifying, doing really incredible work, but no one was willing to provide financial support for that work. And it wasn't until 2019 that, we were able to get off the ground, but I still was not able to secure funding to hire Sara full time. And so much of our work at Human Rights for Kids in the beginning was infused with, my own story of surviving extreme human rights abuses as well as Sara's. And the sort of bridge, the connection that we saw there was the fact that, all of the kids in the justice system, right, who become system involved were once victims of crimes themselves, whether they experienced physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and yet the system wasn't taking that into account. And there was this very unique subset of those children who committed crimes against their abusers, who could sort of be the bridge of that larger conversation. And so it wasn't really until Stoneleigh came along that we were able to secure funding, and Sara really became the second full-time employee at Human Rights for Kids behind myself because of that initial support from the Stoneleigh Foundation. And, this conversation today is so important because it was a long process for us to get to where we are today, and becoming a more trauma-informed organization, becoming an organization that was really prepared to bring people on who had that lived experience. And that journey not only transformed us as an organization, but really has propelled our work going forward. And despite the difficulty that we encountered in the difficulties we've encountered going through this work, I hope to emphasize today the significant rewards that come along with that initial investment. Sarah's a very humble person, and so I want to take a moment to recognize what her work has brought about, not just at Human Rights for Kids, but in the broader field, right? So when Sara started her fellowship, we transformed and shifted a little bit, and again, thanks to the flexibility of the Stoneleigh Foundation. But through her work, we've conducted outreach to more than 800 women across the country who've been incarcerated since childhood. Sara has sent over 4,000 correspondence to those women through direct letters, newsletters that she's created, holiday cards that go out to women. And we get responses back from them all the time where they say, "Thank you for writing to me or sending me this holiday card where I had never received mail before." Some of these women have been incarcerated for decades on end, and nobody's ever sent them a letter just to say, "Hey, we love you, we care about you, we're here to support you." And so Sarah's brought that love and kindness and amazing warmth to these women who oftentimes have never felt that before. Last year, she conducted adverse childhood experiences survey amongst that population of women. It was the first national survey of its kind, specifically looking at the prevalence of trauma among women who've been incarcerated since childhood. In that report that was published back in May, she gave a platform to these women to share about their stories and what they wanted to bring forth, what they wanted the public to know about what they had gone through and what led to their system involvement. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I can't emphasize enough the importance of that report and that work that Sara spearheaded to begin to change the conversation around who these children are and why we can't just be incarcerating them, that we really have to look at the trauma that they've experienced. Through that work, she's also identified more than 20 men and women around the country who've experienced unjust incarceration because they committed offenses against their abusers. She's spearheading the effort to identify pro bono counsel and connect those women and men with people who can represent them. And I'm also proud to say that we're actually representing one of those people at a parole hearing next week. And that never would have happened. This person would not have been identified had it not been for that outreach that Sara initially did, where we were then able to connect with her and begin to represent her in her particular case, and then give her that narrative that she needed to really tell her story in the way that she wanted to tell it. She also founded the Survivor Advocacy Network, which is a network of formerly incarcerated youth who, again, experienced incarceration as a direct result of having committed a crime against somebody who had previously abused them. And then last but not least, we have seen the passage of 4 brand new laws across the country called the Child Sex Crime Victims Protection Act, which was inspired by Sara's advocacy and her work and works to protect children in those circumstances so that they won't be subject to lengthy incarceration or prison sentences like she and so many others were. And the most important of those, I think, is the law that was passed in California last year, SB 545, which now states that when children are in these situations where they commit violent crimes against their sex abusers or their rapists or their traffickers, those children cannot be transferred to adult court no matter what. They have to stay in juvenile court, and all of the trauma that they have experienced has to inform what happens in their case going forward. It is a transformative new policy. It's a transformative movement that Sara has created, and it would not have been possible if not for the investment and the visionary leadership of the Stoneleigh Foundation by investing in directly impacted communities to go out there and to do this work. And so I just want to highlight just all of the incredible work that has happened because of Stoneleigh's belief in Sara and Stoneleigh's belief and partnership with Human Rights for Kids. So just very excited for this conversation today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to our moderator, Cherice Hopkins.
Good afternoon, everyone. As James said, my name is Cherice Hopkins, and I'm very excited to be with you today. I appreciate the Stoneleigh Foundation and Human Rights for Kids for inviting me to moderate this important conversation. I have gotten to know Human Rights for Kids very well through my work. I'm a DEI and social impact strategist, and had the pleasure of working with Human Rights for Kids in several different capacities over the past few years. And that includes in different aspects along their journey of becoming increasingly trauma-informed workplace. And so I got to witness and work alongside them as they did things like revise and create policies to not only institutionalize trauma-informed practices, but lean more deeply into trauma-informed principles and their application and work, as well as in the creation of the white paper reflecting this incredible journey called Trauma is Not Destiny. And so one thing I really want to say that I got to witness was their approach of not just the actions or steps that were taken, but really coming from a place of sincere reflection and transparency about heart posture and mindset and connection, and what these different things meant, not only for their work together, but also how could they take their experiences and support the field and other organizations who are on their own journeys. So I say all that to say that I'm really excited for the conversation that we're about to have. I know that it's going to be a very rich one, and super excited to hear from the folks that we have on our panel. The people who are joining us on our panel that you'll be hearing from are Sara Kruzan, who's the Stoneleigh Fellow at Human Rights for Kids, James Dold, who's the founder and CEO of Human Rights for Kids, Emily Virgin, who's the Director of Advocacy and Government Relations at Human Rights for Kids, and Marie Williams, who's the Deputy Director at the Stoneleigh Foundation. As Mark shared, there will be an opportunity for you all to share your questions. And so we're going to do that later on after I ask a few initial questions of the panel. And so to kick us off, Sara, I am going to be turning to you. And the question that I would like to ask you to get us started is, in the white paper, you speak of the idea of promises and perils when it comes to impacted people working with nonprofit organizations and funders. Can you please explain that concept to our audience? And what are the impacts of these promises and perils?
Yeah, absolutely. So promise and perils, I'm looking at it from a sociology lens, and how the perils can have a liability and a negative impact on one's values, level of trust, and building in relationship. The promises, they come across in times just within our culture under the guise of the criminal justice reform as a whole. There's a lot of promises in that space. And though it is very inviting, having such a broad view of it tends to lose sight of the individualized needs that people really appreciate the opportunity to explore when there's someone there to really listen. And rather that's someone from an organization, rather that's someone from the court system, an advocate. I think anybody who is a part of the criminal justice reform, you'll see promises and paroles in that space. And so when we talk about like vulnerable population, which is the group of folks that have been identified, the women, and now we've extended out to men, so there's thousands of youth. through the promise and perils, taking an individualized approach appears to be more thoughtful, compassionate, and ideal, considering the values of one's journey, of one's trauma, and one's direct impact of how their body received that type of trauma. So looking at it from an external and internal perspective, leading with the impacts of how trauma can be is mostly subconsciously absorbed, right? So you can have an external conversation with folks about what we could do, which usually is inclusive of policy reforms. However, I just want to highlight that having a more individualized approach when engaging folks who have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system allows for such a level of faith within the promise, which will, I believe, eventually lower the perils, right? Like, there's a commitment that people make, especially for an example, I'll use like a parole board hearing. So this is where you really see promises and perils. So in a parole board hearing, there's usually a letter of support that is required to basically underscore how this person's going to transition into the community. So there's going to be, whoever writes that letter basically says, I'm going to support them, I'm going to offer them mentorship, I'm going to make sure that they have housing, I'm going to ensure that, you know, their needs are met and that their transition is well welcome. What I've seen, what I've experienced as well, is a practice that there is a lot of weight given to what is shared in these parole board letters. However, far too often, people are undersourced, they're unhoused, and their needs are not being met. So there's accountability that's placed more on the person that's coming home, that's been removed from the society. Like, you have to prove that you're meeting all these promises, and yet the folks who actually wrote the letter that helped, you know, encourage the parole board members to let you be paroled in the first place, there's no accountability on their part. So I think that looking at the individualized approaches, that people are mindful of what they actually can do, what resources are actually made available. And another really quick I'll say is the lack of accountability that you find within the Department of Corrections. So when someone paroles, they're still under the responsibility of the Department of Correction, which falls under the Attorney General for that state, which the governor has the overall responsibility of that person. So when you see that the resources or the funding that's earmarked specifically to meet this population of folks is not even being assessed, acknowledged, or shared, I mean, that in itself is a peril that I think affects everybody who's been contributing to creating a healing space. So I feel like this is an opportunity to explore more how states and folks who work directly with people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system, looking at more individualized, tailored best practices that lead with accountability in that space. So
thank you, Sarah. That's really powerful, an important reminder that as we consider our collective impact, that we cannot forget about individual experiences, individual needs, as well as, you know, I think we all heard you when you said the word accountability. So asking ourselves those important questions that you raised: what can we actually do? What are the resources that are actually available, so that we can make sure that as we make promises, they do not become perilous. Thank you so much for that. Emily, I want to turn to you next, and I want to ask you, folks may not know, but you have been Sara's direct supervisor during her fellowship. And so I want to say, as a supervisor, what were some of the challenges and mistakes that were made throughout this journey? And what did you learn from them?
Yeah, thanks, Cherice, and thanks everybody for being here. We engaged in this journey to produce this white paper on the first portion of Sara's fellowship, in order to reflect on the things that we got right, but also to reflect on the things that we didn't do right. We think it's really important not to sugarcoat things, because it's not helpful to other organizations. It's not helpful to funders, and so we want this publication that you'll receive at the end of this webinar to be really useful in any journey that you're undertaking in the same vein. So, the way that we set up the fellowship was that, of course, as Marie said, Human Rights for Kids was funded, and Sara came on as a fellow at Human Rights for Kids. James, as the founder and CEO, is my supervisor. And the way that we set up Sara's employment was that I was her direct supervisor. And, that structure, I think, in itself was probably good. But one of the things I think that we got wrong was that Sara, as James said, had a longstanding relationship with James. She had just met me for the first time. And we're a fully remote workplace. And so we had never actually met in person. And so, as you can imagine, there wasn't a whole lot of trust, naturally. They're just, and there wouldn't be in that situation. And so it took a while to build that trust between Sara and I. And one of the ways that we sort of overcame that was by involving James more in our conversations, because of course Sara and James had this longstanding relationship, and so there was more trust in that relationship. And James, as my direct supervisor and as the CEO of the organization, was really intentional in making sure that Sara and I both had the support that we needed, and that he expressed confidence in the work that we were both doing. And that was a really important part of it as well. We also, in the beginning of the fellowship, set up a number of sort of resources and supports that we thought would be helpful to Sara. But what we missed the mark on this, was not respecting Sara's autonomy and not asking Sara about what kind of supports would be helpful for her. So going back to what Sara said about an individualized approach, we didn't hit the mark on that. We pivoted, and I think we've eventually gotten there, but it's something that it was a big takeaway for us, was that before we set up these resources and supports that we thought would be helpful, we need to make sure with people within the organization that those things are actually helpful. And we also, I think, didn't get right quite the level of communication that we needed to have in terms of how this fellowship was set up and how it was different from what Stoneleigh normally does. And so, there was some confusion about, all right, who is the fellow? Who are you reporting to? What's the actual structure? And so I think we should have had a conversation in the very beginning about a very clear structure and a very clear line of communication. But one of the things I think that helped a lot with that was that Marie was always willing, as our program officer, to engage with Sara directly, to engage with me directly, to engage with James directly. I can't tell you how much time she probably put in with all of us, but the confidence that Marie expressed in all of us, and just the time that she was willing to give to each of us, not just individually, but as an organization, really helped us to overcome a lot of those challenges that we faced in the beginning.
That's incredible. And I think just really speaks to, I love how you started talking about the importance of being willing to look at where maybe we didn't get things right in order to be able to pivot. And I don't think you use this word, but kind of where people have their leadership or their power, and using that to affirm and express belief in people. You mentioned Marie doing that for Sara and Human Rights for Kids, and James doing that for you and Sara. And so that is amazing. James, I now want to turn to you with my next question, which is a two-part question. I want to ask you, what kind of support does Stoneleigh offer to Human Rights for Kids throughout this fellowship, and how did it set you all up for success? And the second part is, excuse me, how does that differ from what you've seen in other funding spaces?
Yeah, so I think, and this is kind of a long-running theme that I think is really important for anybody in the funding space to take away, which is that Stonelay's initial belief in us, but then the flexibility and deference to our expertise, and willingness to sort of go along in this journey of learning and iterating was really critical because so much of, I think, what we put into our original grant proposal changed over time, right? And it changed because as we were going through this process with Sara, we were learning more about like where her individual expertise was, what she was really passionate about, and able to sort of shift and incorporate that into revised work plans. And I think that that made a significant difference in not only the quality of work that was being done, but also just the individual success and happiness that everyone felt in that work, right? And that only was possible through Stonelay's flexibility as a funder on the programmatic side. But that also existed on the budgetary side as well. There were definitely shifts that we made in how some of the resources that were provided by Stoneleigh were allocated, particularly when it came to just providing certain levels of support for Sara and the program that she was leading. And there was always flexibility. There was always, oftentimes I think a lot of organizations get really nervous if you begin to change too much the original plan that you had outlined to a particular funder. But it was never that way with Stoneleigh. And it never felt that, I never felt like I was walking on eggshells or, like, oh gosh, I got to go into a meeting and talk with Marie about how we're changing what we had originally talked about. Because she always approached it with a level of humility and engagement that just made everyone feel comfortable. And I think part of it too was, our belief was that if we could create this program and really create this platform and walk hand in hand with Sara, that it could create a model for other nonprofits and other philanthropic partners to be able to utilize not just in the criminal justice reform space, but also in similarly situated movements, right? Because it's fundamentally about, how do you center people? And how do you center people who have lived experiences and maybe have trauma in their background that organizations typically don't create policies and infrastructure around to support, right? I think there's a level of, there's a certain level of disconnect between the work that's being done on the ground and the communities that are directly impacted by harmful practices. And what we wanted to be able to do in this process was to bridge that divide. And, Stonelay's flexibility, I think, really allowed us to lean into that. And so, I think that those were the main things. And then I would just say from, again, from a foundation standpoint, for most of the work, and I think my colleagues who are similarly situated as executive directors would say this. There is always this this dynamic that exists between funder and grantee, and you oftentimes worry about making changes in programs or making changes in budgets, and with that comes an added level of stress. But one of the things I really appreciated about Stoneleigh as a funder. It wasn't really, it was almost like changing the dynamic of not so much looking at them as a funder, but as a true partner, right? And I think that that is a key difference in what historically takes place in the philanthropic sector. Emily mentioned just a little while ago about how Marie literally had calls like with all three of us. Because I think we were having like we all came from different perspectives, right? Like Emily was directly supervising Sara, Sara was the Stoneleigh Fellow, and then I was, kind of, working with both Emily and Sara on the implementation of this project. And, she had the unique insight, I think, to sort of see this through the perspective of all three people. And that's another important part that I think is a good lesson for other organizations in this space is I think sometimes there's a tendency for organizations, EDs, to maybe be gatekeepers to funders. But I think it's really important to make sure that your staff is able to directly engage and talk and have communication with program officers at foundations because it gives them a unique insight into what's actually happening on the ground. And so, I think all of those things have really led to this really incredible program we've been able to establish and the amazing work that Sara's been able to do while she's been here.
That's wonderful. So definitely hearing you, flexibility is key for sure. Marie, I definitely want to get your voice in this conversation and also have a two-part question for you. And that question is, what has Stoneleigh learned through the direct work with Human Rights for Kids and Sara, and through Stoneleigh's larger journey of supporting directly impacted people? And the second part of that question is, why should other organizations show the same flexibility and support?
Yeah, thank you. And first, before I answer the question, I have to say how extraordinarily generous James and Emily both have been in reflecting on Stoneleigh's role in this journey. A lot of it we collectively had to make up as we went along, right? It was not due to any extraordinary wisdom on my part, certainly, even though there may have been some wisdom on the part of our executive director, Ronnie Bloom. So in answer to your question about what Stoneleigh's learned, I would say 3 or 4 things. I think the first for us was that it's important to provide more than rhetorical support for partnerships and inclusion of the voices of people with lived experience. There were a lot of public statements that happened around 2020, 2021. Organizations, including our own, made it clear that we wanted to stand in partnership with people who felt as though their voices had not been heard and that they had not been engaged in crafting solutions to really difficult social problems. But I think what we learned in this partnership that it's important to do more than that, right? You have to also walk the talk, and that walk can sometimes be a challenging one for foundations and institutions that have done business in a certain way for a very, very long time, and we're suddenly called upon to do it differently. The other lesson that we learned is that as a foundation, we don't often realize that grantees can incur significant real costs, as do people with lived experience, in trying to show up to these conversations and policy discussions. And funders need to recognize those real costs in the grant awards that they make. And many of those costs are often unanticipated. And the support that we can provide may not always be financial support, but it's important that we continue to be supportive. So when I hear, James and Emily talking and, about the phone calls that I had to have, sure, there were a lot of phone calls, but it's the least I can do, right, is to sort of walk hand in hand with Human Rights for Kids and with Sara as grantees and experience as they are experiencing the challenges of implementing the project with fidelity. And I think one of the things certainly that I learned personally is that it's important to break down that sort of glass wall between and not even glass. I think it's pretty much an opaque wall between the grantee and the funder where the grantee wants to put their best foot forward always. They don't want to be expansive when they're sharing the problems that they're encountering, right? The problems become really, really small when when you share it with your funder and the successes become really, really large. And that was not the kind of relationship I wanted to have in this instance because, as a funder of fellowships, Stoneleigh is in the people business. We're not just in the project business. So I wanted to know exactly what they were experiencing as they were building out this program. Another lesson that I learned, and I think I've always known this, and I think other funders on the call can certainly relate to this, is that human-centered work can be unpredictable. We just don't know what people are going through and what they may go through and what is happening in their lives. So flexibility is absolutely key. And we need, as funders and folks who support this work, to leave room for variances from the initial agreed upon metrics. So it would have been wholly unreasonable for me as or fellow Sara is experiencing her own life changes and challenges to say, well, you know what, I kind of sort of don't care. What did the work plan say? This is what you guys need to do. So, that was a lesson that I think I didn't learn for the first time, but I was reminded of in this instance. And the organization, as one that was building something new, had to have the room to fail. There had to be room to fail and then try something new. So certainly that was something I kept front of mind. And finally, to the second part of your question, I think it's super important for funders and others who, sort of put out there this platitude that we want you to engage people with lived experience. It's important for us to remember that this is not a flavor of the month issue. That if we're really, really serious about addressing some of the most difficult problems that our society is facing, we have to consider the wisdom and the experience of our key informants. And those key informants are the people who experienced and live with those problems, sometimes long after the actual experience is over. It's not just a cute thing to say because, the streets are burning and people are protesting. We actually get to better and more effective approaches and outcomes if we take into account the voices of the people who've lived these problems and continue to live with them.
Thank you, Marie. So many amazing gems that you just dropped for us. One that's definitely standing out for me was just your recognition that this incredible work that takes place involves mental and emotional labor, and how can that be a part of the support? And it sounds like that helped lean into what Sara started us talking about, which is the ability to expand to not just the collective work, but folks to individuals, and also just want to notice you mentioned that word that sometimes we don't always bring up, failure, and how you mentioned, that in order for us to be able to shift from status quo and support people in the work as needed, we have to create room for that. So many gems. Thank you so much. Sara, I wanted to come back to you. I know Emily talked a little bit about trust. And so I want to be sure to ask you about trust as well. I know in the paper, you know how important it is for organizations to trust people with lived experience. And I want to ask you, why is this crucial to success and long-term sustainability? And also, how did you go about developing trust with Human Rights for Kids and Stoneleigh? And what steps did you observe them taking to gain your trust?
And thank you for that. I think definitely trust is huge. I think because, well, I want to share that when I first came home from prison, which was 2013, I gave everybody my trust. Everyone had 100%. Like I was buying into everything and available. And I see now the beauty of having like a 10-year experience. Looking back, I am not as trustful. I'm like, we're not going to start at 100% because a lot of that has been not well received or misleading or unnecessary for some folks, and how everyone has a unique way of coming in what the value is of what trust is. It's very personal. It's very individualized. It's not usually like a hot topic of conversation when people are there. It's almost like, well, we share what we believe our trust is. And some folks' level of trust is 50%, right? And others are higher. So the level of trust is so important, even if it falls apart and you got to rebuild it again, the failure piece. So there's so much beauty in looking at the crumbled pieces, looking at how this, like, oh my God, went this way, and saying, okay, so let's put what we have back together. Let's, build this together. And I think when you can see people in their most vulnerable space and they're comfortable being vulnerable in that's where real trust comes in, and I think with working with folks with in the criminal justice space, there's such a blurred line. There's such a blurred line on who's almost expected to share their most difficult experiences. And it's not like your executive director is going to say, or someone with powers or resources, or is going to say, you know what, let me give you all of my horrible moments. I was raped here. I was abused here. I had a domestic violence situation here. I thought about killing myself over here. That's not what people in positions of power are usually reading with. But that is what folks who've been directly impacted by the criminal justice system, that's what we lead with. So that in itself is not a balanced space, right? So there's a subconscious impact of power dynamics that you feel it. And then the level of trust that comes from folks who have been inside of a system of oppressive behavior. There's this automatic need to be compliant. Okay, no problem. Easy. No, there's not a lot of pushback because of the institutionalization of oppression and exploiting people's traumas. And I think that when folks who want to work directly with people who have been impacted and have that, there's a strength in that. There's beauty in that. There's leadership in that. Usually folks aren't automatically placed in positions of leadership. And there's this presumed assumption that folks trust that are, leading these orgs, that they can make the best decisions, and leaving out the key component of what the person who's been directly impacted and has lived that oppressive state, and place them in a position where their strengths are uplifted, as opposed to feeling like you have to earn it, or you're not quite worthy. We think you are here, but we want to mold you over here. And I don't think folks need caretakers, and they don't need parents. What they need is a positive, safe support system or person who understands the beauty and the value of vulnerabilities, and not wanting to repurpose that for a political agenda. And I say that because a lot of times one's trauma, if they fit the political narrative at that time, then they're usually exploited and only uplifted if it fits a collective narrative. And so trust is very important. It's very personal, especially when we are talking about the impacts of what usually places a young child or a young person in front of the criminal justice system in the first place. And I want to really, really highlight that through this outreach, the letters that just radiate with trust from the folks that are incarcerated and what they share, they're so forthcoming. And I'm thinking, oh my God, you have no clue how, someone had, that. And so now it's like, oh, there's this okay, we're here now at this crossroads where if we want to really be mindful of creating a safe, healthy way of handling the experiences of folks who've been directly impacted, we're here. We're here to do it, and so in that, trust is going to just blossom and become a garden as it is to be, which aligns with John and Chara Haas's, especially Chara. I read up on, their philanthropy and the reason why they even committed a lifelong and beyond, dedication to fund this work. As Chara had a garden, and that her garden, she loved her garden, and they wanted to help people, and they loved the children of the community, and it resonated so deeply because that was back in 2006. That they started the foundation. Here it is now, to almost many years. It's 2024, and some of the important work is being compared with a garden of love, and it comes across in the letters and things like that. So I think that building up resilience through adverse experiences really does reflect of the overall goal for the Stoneleigh Foundation, with extra support with human rights for kids. So it's beautiful in that case. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sara. I think it was just such a important insights and reminders for us to be intentional and reflective of how we're entering relationships. How are we viewing ourselves? When you said we don't need a caregiver, I felt that. I felt that was heard. As well as how are we seeing, system impacted people? Are we viewing folks as leaders or colleagues or as folks in need of care? And I just thought it was really beautiful when you described trust as something we can build together. So thank you so much for that. Emily, I now want to come back to you. I know before when you were sharing, you were talking about some of the steps that Human Rights for Kids took, that specifically in regard to building trust, but I want to see if you can please expand and tell us more about other things that the organization did to become a trauma-informed workplace, particularly actions that were taken or specific policies that you all adopted that can be replicated by other organizations.
Yeah, so we did a number of things. First, James and I did a trauma-informed supervision training that I think really highlighted a lot of the things that Sara just talked about in terms of trauma responses and learning those trauma responses, because you might, think that a person with lived experience might react one way, but there are a variety of trauma responses that, I had not heard about before. And so learning the different ways that people can respond, especially in the workplace, was really important because I was able to just, be a little more, just have a little more insight into, how someone with lived experience might respond to a number of situations. And after that, we undertook a project to review all of our employee policies, our handbook. Cherice was instrumental in helping us do that. The way that we started that was to have Cherice conduct interviews with all of our staff at HRFK on an anonymous basis. And then Cherice came to James and I with the feedback from that. And from that feedback, we then reviewed and revised our employee handbook. And one of the things that we did was that we put in some policies just around making sure that people could take care of themselves. So instituting a self-care day, making sure that our paid time off policy was inclusive of not just physical health, but mental health as well, clarifying that that's just as important for folks to take care of. We extended some of our policies Before, that had been limited to if you had been at HRFK for a certain period of time. We extended some of those to people who were new in their positions as well. So didn't put a time limit on, for example, when they could take leave for bereavement. And, a lot of this stuff was just, we had taken standard HR policies and had incorporated them, but hadn't looked at them in a trauma-informed way, or really like a people-centered way, or an individualized approach way. We, instituted flexible scheduling. We're a remote workplace, so things are fairly flexible, but we, generally work 9 to 5. But when it came to, if we were asking someone to engage in, advocacy work that could be particularly triggering, we wanted to make sure that the person, had the opportunity to take the next day off or take the next morning off, because knowing the effects that could have on a person, as Sara talked about, reliving or talking about the worst things that had ever happened to you, that understandably takes a toll, and a workplace shouldn't ignore that. We need to remember that and make accommodations as such. We, in terms of other things, not specific policies, but just kind of, practices that we undertook, I think that, what Sara was just speaking to about, not being paternalistic, and respecting autonomy. That was a really important practice that I think, we didn't do a great job of at first, but tried to incorporate that throughout the experience after Sara brought things to our attention, frankly. And I think, what Sara highlighted as well was that, people who have lived experiences are so often just expected to talk about those experiences, and without a recognition that this person has so much more to offer outside of their lived experience. And so not expecting Sara to just talk about her experience and her lived experience and her interaction with the legal system, incorporating that into her work plan and pivoting in terms of, all right, you're not going to be, expected to do just that work, or you're not going to be expected to do that work at all. You have a skill set beyond your lived experience that is really important. And I think, one of the other things that I learned personally was just, respecting boundaries. And if Sara said, "Hey, I need to miss something," or, just something like that, not pushing for more information, I think is important as well, because I think I brought with me more of a traditional employment mindset. And I had to break out of that and learn that, in order to get the best from people and to allow them to lean into their strengths, flexibility is required. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from this entire conversation, is that, flexibility is required in all of these things, whether it's from the funder, whether it's from supervisors, whether it's from CEOs, that we have to learn to be more flexible in these spaces.
So many great examples of things that people might want to incorporate into their organizations. And I really appreciate, that everything you mentioned first stemmed from learning about trauma and learning from the team about their experiences and what they wanted. And one thing I also just wanted to add that I thought that was really awesome that you all did was consider the language that you used in the policies. Going back to what Emily said about being people-centered and human rights for kids, I found was also looking at it from the standpoint of, oh, these documents can feel like compliance language and they can be kind of heavy. What does that mean for the person reading it? Will they really want to or feel supported to actually take these things that we're trying to make available? And so what does it look like to switch the language so that it actually feels accessible to people? And so I thought just another incredible thing that you all did to be able to support your team. James, I also want to check in with you about advice you have to other organizations. And specifically, I want to ask first, like, if you could share as executive director, what are some of the challenges or roadblocks that you recall of Human Rights for Kids facing in regards to becoming a more trauma-informed workplace? And what advice would you have for other organizations that are considering hiring impacted people?
Yeah, thank you, Cherice. And I actually want to go back to and just highlight, I think a point that Sarah was making, but it's really important to emphasize, which is that so much of this work, I think, isn't just about, changing policies or changing communities, but actually like healing. And what I found in the work, just as somebody who's experienced trauma, who's had family members who've gone through the system, is that so much of the work that we do, there's an element where it's healing for me. There's a catharsis that comes from this work, from getting to see other people reunited with their families, to getting to see people live their best lives and really live out the light. Excuse me, live out the light that's within them. And I remember talking to Sara early on about what we used to term Sarah's Law, but now the Child Sex Crime Victims Protection Act. Um, you know, I I wanted her to have the experience that I had in 2013 when I got to write a bill that criminalized what happened to me as a form of child labor trafficking in my home state of Nevada. Because through that process, even though I wasn't going to get any sense of justice through any formal process, just the fact of a new policy being created and members of the community rallying behind you in recognition of what happened to you as being wrong, that was healing, right? SB 545, passing was healing, right? And so much of this work, I oftentimes don't think we place enough emphasis on how the work itself can and help people heal and help communities heal. And that oftentimes gets lost. And it goes back to the question that you asked before, Cherice, about what makes the Stoneleigh Foundation different about how they approach this work. And I think it was that emphasis on individual healing as part and parcel as a collective community healing that's integral to societal change, right? And there's so many things that are happening right now in our society that we haven't healed from, right? Going back to the days of slavery and systemic racism that we're still dealing with, part of that is because we haven't healed as a society, right? And so we can't heal as a society unless we have individual healing, we have collective healing within our movements, right? And so just living out that ethic, I think, is so important. What I'll say about the challenges and advice, first, I'm very fortunate. I work with an incredible staff at Human Rights for Kids, and they take on so much and they lead with empathy and compassion and love. That's a lot of our values that we bring up and talk about in our staff meetings regularly. And so I'm very fortunate to have Emily and Teresa and Aiden and Sara to work with because they make this work so much easier and so much of a joy to be around them and to be engaged in this work on a regular basis. I will say like a lot of the challenges that we had in the beginning, I think were self-inflicted because of on my part, right? I think I approached this process thinking that there'd be sort of trust through osmosis in some ways. It's like, okay, like Sarah's coming on board. Her and I have known each other for, a decade now. It'll be fine, and not really leaning into this idea of individual relationships and how those take time to develop, right? And that's something that's important for every CEO, every organization, every funder to recognize is that these things can't happen overnight, right? You have to invest in the relationships, you have to invest in the people and allow that trust to build over time. And, I think sometimes we can have the best intentions as organizations and, those don't necessarily translate into the best outcomes, right? And so Emily talked before about, some of the original supports that we put in place without consulting with Sara. And some of that was done because I was at the time Sara was starting, I was going out on parental leave, and I was like, okay, like here are all the things I think should be in place for Sara as she comes on and transitions. and not having had that full conversation with her to actually understand what she wanted, what she needed, right? And I think just that process of stepping back a little bit and incorporating people into that process would have made a world of difference. And so, you can't make any assumptions, right? And you need to have, more than anything, this is a mindset, right? There's not one set of policies or a series of policies that you can implement to become a more trauma-informed organization. It's about, how you see the people that you work with, right? And it's also not just about individuals who might come from directly impacted communities. All of us, right, through our shared human experiences, have different traumas that we've experienced, right? Whether it's a loss of a loved one, whether it's, divorce, or whether it's separation. There's something that's happened in our lives where there's trauma. And the question for us as CEOs and leaders of organizations and organizations themselves is, what do I want to do to create a workplace that understands and accepts that people come with different levels of trauma and experience, and create a space where they can come to work free from judgment, free from fear, where they can, live out their best version of themselves. And so this isn't just about, directly impacted communities, although that, I think that's a driving force behind why we embark on in this process. What I've learned is that it's much bigger than that, right? It's about all of us collectively and what kind of workspaces that we want to create to support the people that we work with when challenges arise, right? And that can even come up in the context of secondary trauma, right? And so much of the work we deal with, tough issues, right? Abuse, neglect, incarceration. These are significant traumas, and oftentimes people, if we're not careful, we can, experience secondary trauma. And so one of the things that we also did, was to, and I don't think Emily touched on this, but we did a training for all of our staff on secondary trauma and, what to look out for, the signs, and sort of how do you mitigate against that. And so it's just being hyper conscious of those sorts of things, and, and talking to your staff and recognizing that you don't have all of the answers. I think the biggest thing is when things do go wrong, take personal accountability as it's tough because I don't always see myself as like the leader of our organization, right? But I realize like people like look at me in that way. And so in that vein, right, recognizing that you have a responsibility to take accountability when things go wrong and being okay with that. Recognizing that you're human and like you're going to make mistakes, and owning up to it and apologizing when you do make those mistakes to your staff, to folks that you've brought on board. And then just not, having the flexibility to recognize that this process is long, and there are going to be times where it's hard, right? Sometimes it gets hard. And it's in those moments that you're tested the most. Is like, is this something that you really value? Is this really embedded in the values of the organization, where you're not going to just make a split judgment and decide, okay, I'm gonna punish this person for X, or I'm gonna take this action because I didn't like how somebody did X, Y, or Z. But step back and say, hey, you know what? This is actually a teachable moment, right? If we're really invested, if we really care about the people that we profess to serve, part of that is not only helping them walk, on their own healing journey, but also sort of uplifting them so that they, can get the experiences that they need, that they can carry over throughout their entire lives, about what it means to work in this space, right? Whether it's, maybe this is the first organization that they've worked at, maybe it's the first job in the nonprofit sector, right? And understanding that and not taking for granted, right, that oftentimes we accumulate a lot of knowledge and wisdom over the course of years. And there are some people, particularly in the criminal justice space, who just haven't had those experiences, particularly people who went to prison as children. And so you have to give them grace and compassion, and not just them, but everyone in your organization, right? Because that's what everybody really needs. And I think when you can lead in that way, you end up developing a culture where people, love to work. Like my big thing, one of the things I'm most proud of is that nobody's left the organization that we've hired so far. And so that's something like I'm really happy about, right? Because you hear sometimes about there's all this staff turnover and yada yada yada. But one of the things that like we've really strived to do is create a space where people love to work at Human Rights for Kids and can feel like they can be the best and most authentic version of themselves. And again, that plays out through trust, through compassion, through empathy, and then working with experts. I want to give a plug real quick for your company, Cherice, In Harmony LLC. We've done so much work with them over the years, and everything that Emily mentioned in terms of the, looking at our employee handbook and interviewing staff and putting together a white paper. All of that work was really spearheaded by Cherice and her amazing company. So if there are organizations that are out there that are listening in, philanthropies, nonprofits, definitely would encourage you to reach out to Cherice to help you along that path, because she was instrumental in walking alongside us and in what we've learned here today. And so just want to give a plug for that. But those are, some of the big things that I think we've learned over our time and some of the challenges we encountered.
Well, thank you for those lovely words, James, and as like all the great insights and the recommendations you gave. And I know one of the first ones you said was, it's about mindset. And I think what you shared about this not just being about addressing harm, but we can take a strength-based approach and like also recognize that this work is also about supporting people in healing is incredibly powerful. How do we support people to live out the light within? That's amazing. I'm definitely gonna hold on to that for myself. And definitely, Marie, before we turn and open it up for questions from our audience, I want to be sure that we hear from you again as well. And so my question for you is, you've noted that Sara's fellowship did not fit well within Stoneleigh's traditional structure. And so I'm really curious about, what are the organization's values that underpin flexibility and the support that you all showed Human Rights for Kids and Sara?
Sure. I think first, I should say that Stoneleigh strives to be a learning organization. We try to stay humble about exactly where our expertise lies. I think a trap that funders can sometimes fall into is beginning to believe that we're the subject matter experts, right? I mean, certainly the folks that staff foundations tend to have some experience in the subject matter, but we're not in the weeds of it. And if you've been in philanthropy for quite some time, I've only been in philanthropy now for about 8 years. You can lose touch with what's happening on the ground. So what we try to do always at Stoneleigh is trust that our fellows and our grantees know more than us about how a problem is best addressed, right? So we have to remain sort of open to learning from them and hearing their expertise. And, we've also, over the past, I want to say 4 to 5 years, strive to listen to more stories and narratives as told by people who lived the problems that we're hoping to solve. Almost everybody is impressed by a PhD or a master's or a JD or whatever degree, but oftentimes that is not where a lot of the key information lies when you're looking to solve problems. And one example that I'm reminded of in that is that while Stoneleigh was sort of saying to the world and to ourselves that we wanted to support people with lived experience, that we wanted to meet people where they are, and that we wanted to be supportive, we had not done until very, very recently what Emily described Human Rights for Kids as having done. Looking at policies, looking at practices, looking at the way that we relate to our fellows, and ensuring that we gave them not just professional development support, but personal development support. So tools and resources for self-care, recognizing that the work that they do is almost always, no, not almost, is always around really difficult issues, the ones that James described, right? A broken criminal justice system, a sometimes harmful child welfare system, um, a not always responsive behavioral health system, um, a difficult school system. Like these are all things that could be, the location of significant trauma or, problems that our fellows have to confront every day in their work. And we've begun as an organization within Stoneleigh to look at the extent to which we may or may not be providing adequate supports for fellows to face those problems day in, day out. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think the overarching value that Stoneleigh hopes to promote and support is, caring, loving, supportive communities, healing communities. And to the extent that we're in a position to provide resources to bring that about, we definitely remain attentive to that.
Thank you so much, Marie. It's a great example of, how our values cannot just be words on a website, but how we can really use them to shift and inform the work that we're doing. Want to be sure to take a little bit of time before we wrap up to get some of the questions that we have. I want to start. One of the things that was shared was not a question, but just some words of appreciation for Sara that I wanted to bring into the space. And it says, Sara, your fortitude and encouraging remarks have resonated deeply during this conversation. Your thoughtful insights are sincerely appreciated. As you emphasize, trust is a fundamental aspect for survivors, and it's indeed hard to entrust others with it. Thank you for your tireless efforts. We also have another question, or this one is a question, and I'll open it up for anyone on the panel. The question is, as a member of a state parent partnership board designed to remind state agencies that work with children and families of the importance of not creating systems and policy without the input of those it is supposed to help, what system have you put into place now to make sure you can get meaningful input from future advocates with lived experience before setting up resources and supports for them?
Yeah, and I can jump in here and feel free, Emily or Sarah, to chime in as well. I think one of the things that, as a result of Sarah's fellowship, that we've started to be more intentional about is our engagement with directly impacted communities. And through that, we're in the very beginning stages now of actually coordinating. Sarah's doing this work, coordinating regular meetings with the loved ones of people we've identified through our initial outreach for our Crimes Against Humanity report. And our plan is to grow that over time so that those folks, whether they be parents, whether they be brothers, sisters, loved ones, have an opportunity to help engage in advocacy and to inform, the work going forward. From an organizational standpoint, in terms of people that we hire in the future, I think all of those things that Emily talked about is something that will we have institutional knowledge around, right? And so when we do bring on, other folks from directly impacted communities, we'll be much more intentional about making sure, we get insight from them on, where their strengths are, and being flexible again in terms of looking at how can we, help shift and change work plans and be nimble as possible to make sure that their expertise is centered. One of the things that we really try to make sure is that I'm very I'm very much always concerned about this, which is the tokenization. I think Marie and Sarah mentioned earlier, in part because I've experienced that myself as a survivor. I know a lot of people in the survivor space experience tokenization, and so really wanting to make sure that we center people's work and experiences and what they have to offer through the lens of where their expertise is, and that may or may not be in an advocacy role, can be in a whole host of other positions. So recognizing people for who they are and how they show up. So I think those are the big things that I'd highlight there. I don't know, Emily or Sarah, if you have anything else to add there.
And I'd like to jump in if I can really quickly, Cherice. I mean, I think even if that question wasn't directed at funders, I'm aware there may be other funders on the call, so I wanted to weigh in a little bit. I think the light lift is on the funder side, right? We can simply require of our grantees that they get meaningful input from future advocates with lived experience. We could just put it in our grant requirements. But I think what I want to underscore is that we need to do more than that. And one of the ways that Stoneleigh has tried to step up to the plate on this is to not simply say you need to get that meaningful input from future advocates, but to ensure that our grantees have the resources to, provide recompense for that. So if someone says, as a part of their grant proposal, we're going to convene a youth advisory council comprised of formerly incarcerated young people, we think it's incumbent upon funders to say, oh, that's great. Are you going to pay them? And are you going to pay them well? Are you going to make it possible for them to participate? Is there going to be transportation? What time of day are these meetings of this advisory council going to happen? Are you going to provide meals if it's in the evening? So I think, I think the role that funders can play in that, making sure that system is in place, is to ensure that whatever system is devised by the grantee is resourced, because that's our role, right? Make sure that it's resourced. Make sure that they've figured out a way to provide the right space and the right table and the right conditions that would allow for that meaningful input. I think it's very easy to say that, grantees should do this, that, and the third. And oftentimes, because we have funding caps, we'll say, we want you to do all these things and we want you to do it for less than $150,000 a year. Grantees then twist themselves in pretzels to try to get it under the budget cap and think, you know what, I'm going to find in-kind support to do the other things. I think we just need sometimes as funders to take the blinders off a little bit and assess whether or not the ask is realistic when we, make these demands.
Thank you. And Sarah, I see you're off mute. I want to give you a chance to respond, but I also wanted to share the second question with you in case you could also answer it as part of your response as well. Our second question is, as a survivor of human trafficking, what advice can you give to individuals coming into this line of work to help change the future of this matter?
Sure. So I think language alignment and just understanding how important it is to ask the individuals who are directly impacted by these policies or these drawn up contracts and agreements, what is it that they need? I think that the hierarchy of Maslow's law, all that great stuff, that theory is really, there's truth in that. So building a basic foundation of safety and meeting the basic needs, right? That's stable and consistent. We don't want to say, you get this for about 5 years and then, hopefully by then you'll have it all together and, hopefully you'll get to where you need to go, right? I think that there's negligent handoffs in a lot of the way that Americans treat people with moral injuries, constantly being induced on folks unintentionally a lot of times, right? Because it's part of the culture. So I think anybody who identifies as a survivor of violence, just asking what they need. When it comes to state agencies, a lot of the contracts, historically, I've researched the contracts because I'm curious, where is this money coming from? What are they doing with it? It's earmarked, it's taxpayers. It's I have to understand why these folks for years aren't getting their needs met. And, the community violence that continues, it's exasperated due to the lack of resources and hearing what the folks need. And there's an influx of trauma that's captured through the body, which shows up through the person's actions. And then you have a person present right there in front of a judge, right? And so everybody has an opportunity to sit down and ask what these needs are. The workers, the state agencies, and then we have the capacity and the beauty in our democracy to rewrite these laws that we hold ourselves accountable for. These laws are written by a person. They can be changed to meet the current climate of cultural needs that are inclusive and individualized. And so that's like, we have the beauty to do that. You know, we definitely have the beauty. I know we're short on time, so, but yeah.
Thank you so much, Sara. And thank you for everyone who submitted your questions. Before we wrap up, we also just had a question that we wanted to ask all of you. It's a poll question that we're going to pull up right now. Or actually, there's two. The first one is, which is more important to you when working with system impacted individuals? Is it the quality of their work or the quantity of their work? So just an opportunity for you all to reflect and share in light of the conversation that we've had. And then we also, want to learn and hear from you all. And so the second question is, what can your organization do to become more trauma informed, involve people directly impacted by systems? And so maybe you're considering something that you've heard during this conversation. Maybe there's some other things that you're all doing, but we would definitely like to hear from you. And so we'd ask that you just take a few seconds and complete these poll questions for us. And I believe our poll responses are going to be able to come up. Yes, and so we have about 93% of people responded so far who said the quality of their work, and 7% who said the quantity. So thank you for for your reflecting and your sharing with us. Sara, did you want to mention anything about that real quickly?
Yeah, really quick. So that's great. That quality over quantity, a lot of funding, whether that's from state agencies, NGOs, private funding, it usually tends to go for the quantity. They like the numbers. The numbers are like, yeah, we need the numbers. But the quality of the work, so what is required for this, and so the value. So I think if funders or state agencies start to look at policies to offer these resources, then you want to fund the quality, which will give back to the people, which will kind of like take away from that moral injury that's kind of gets lost. Yeah. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, I know we're almost at time, but I just want to be sure to thank all of our panelists as well as Mark, who's in the background, and turn it back over to Marie before we wrap up today. Thank you so much.
I'm off mute. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so just again, wanting to reiterate how important this conversation was for Stoneleigh to host, and thank you all for joining us today. But it would be remiss of me not to mention, just as a closing salvo, that this work and this funding partnership between Human Rights for Kids and Stoneleigh will come to an end in the spring, I believe, of 2025. And we are painfully aware that even though Stoneleigh will exit stage left to some degree on this work, the work will continue. So to the extent that there are any funders on the call, I'm going to urge you to, reach out to Human Rights for Kids. If this is within your priorities, I assume it is, if you're here, to see how you might support the work. I'm always happy to have conversations with other funders about why we think this is an extraordinary body of work that needs to be sustained well beyond Stoneleigh's involvement. So I just put that offer out there for folks who want to reach out to me. And certainly I'm sure James as well, or Sara or Emily would love to hear from you also. And a couple of quick housekeeping notes for those of you who are still on the call and may want to tell folks about it. The webinar was recorded, so we're going to share the recording and any other resources mentioned during the webinar in a follow-up email. We invite you to share that with other folks who you think might be interested and were not able to join. And of course, we may not have been able to get to every question today, or questions may arise that you did not think of during the webinar. Please reach out to us if you'd like follow-up with one or all of the speakers. And a quick plug for Stoneleigh. We love doing webinars. We're always sharing new information with our partners. Our next webinar will be one with the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, a partner organization of human rights for kids, also involved in the same righteous work. This one will be on restorative justice on Tuesday, October 29th from 3 to 4:30 p.m. Stay tuned for more details on that. And, joining Cherice in thanking everybody who's been a part of this panel, and hoping the rest of you have a great afternoon.